The emergency alert had been screaming for 11 seconds when I walked into the briefing room and found Ambassador Viral already standing at the window, staring at the star field outside with his 4 pale eyes wide open. He was holding a data tablet so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. On the screen, a list of names scrolled slowly. Names of species, names of colonies, names of worlds that had been raided, looted, or simply erased over the past 3 centuries of recorded galactic history. He did not hear me come in. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the machine in the corner, sat down in the chair nearest the door, and waited. I had been the human liaison to the Galactic Conclave for 3 years. I had learned that Thessians like Viral needed a moment before they could speak. Their minds worked differently from ours. They processed things in layers, one layer at a time, very carefully, like a person peeling an orange without breaking the skin. He finally turned around. "Every species," he said. His voice was low and careful. "Every single one." "What are you looking at?" I asked, though I already knew. He held up the tablet. The incident registry. 312 years of documented raids, territorial seizures, forced evacuations, and resource extractions carried out against inhabited worlds. He set the tablet down on the table and slid it toward me. "I have been reading it for the past 2 hours. I started because of what happened to the Thessian outposts last night. I wanted to understand the pattern. I wanted to know who is safe and who is not." I picked up the tablet and scrolled through it slowly. The list was long. The Keth had raided Thessian border colonies 6 times in the last century alone. The Vran mercenary fleets had hit the Doral homeworld twice. The Sarath had lost 3 moons to opportunistic resource extraction by a species that no longer even existed. Everyone had been hit. Everyone had bled. "I noticed something," Viral said. "You?" He pulled it back and tapped a name on the filter panel. One name. One species. The list disappeared. Every entry vanished. The screen showed nothing but white space and the words, "No results found." "Humans," he said. He looked at me with an expression I had come to recognize in Thessians. It was the look they gave something they did not understand and were not sure they should approach. Not one incident. Not one raid. Not one contested border claim that escalated into a military action. Not one colony ship interdicted. Not one resource dispute settled by force. In 312 years of records, he paused. I went back further. 600 years of records, the same result. I drank my coffee. "That is not an accident," he said. "No," I agreed, "it is not." He sat down across from me. The station hummed quietly around us. Somewhere down the corridor, I could hear the sound of voices rising and falling. The Conclave had been in a state of quiet panic since the Garath attacked those outposts. Every delegation was holding emergency sessions, calling home, sending alerts. The corridors were full of whispered conversations and frightened faces, but this room was quiet. "Why?" Viral asked. "Why does no one ever target the humans?" I looked at him for a moment. He was a good person. I had worked beside him for 3 years, and I knew that about him the way you know certain things about people, without being able to explain exactly when you learned it. He was careful. He was honest. He asked questions because he genuinely wanted to understand the answers, not because he wanted to win an argument. "Do you actually want to know?" I said. "Yes," he said, without hesitating. I set down my coffee. I looked out the window at the stars. There were so many of them from here, scattered across the dark in every direction, each one a sun, most of them circled by worlds. Many of those worlds home to someone who was afraid of something tonight. That had always been true, for as long as anyone had been keeping records. Fear was the oldest common language in the galaxy. "Then I will tell you," I said. "But I want you to understand something before I start. What I am about to tell you is not a story about power. It is not a story about weapons or fleets or military doctrine, though all of those things are part of it. It is a story about what a species becomes when it has spent its entire existence at war with itself." Viral tilted his head slightly. "At war with itself? Humans did not evolve on a safe world," I said. "We did not grow up on a planet where cooperation came naturally because the environment was manageable. We grew up on a planet that was trying to kill us from the very beginning. Ice, drought, predators, disease, other humans." I let that last word sit in the air for a moment. "Mostly other humans." He was quiet. "Every civilization in this galaxy," I continued, "evolved to survive something external. A harsh climate, a predator species, scarce resource. You learned to work together because the world outside was dangerous, and unity was the only answer. That produced species that are good at cooperation, good at building, good at long-term thinking." I looked at him steadily. "Humans learned to survive each other. For tens of thousands of years, the most dangerous thing on our planet was us. Not the cold, not the predators. Us." Viral picked up his tablet again but did not look at it. He was listening. That changes things, I said. It changes everything, actually. When your primary threat is external, you build walls and you cooperate behind them. When your primary threat is internal, you develop something different. You develop the ability to look at another person and instantly, constantly, assess them. You develop the ability to plan against people who are planning against you. You develop the ability to deceive, to predict, to outmaneuver, and to absorb punishment in ways that external threat species never had to learn. The alert on the wall panel had stopped blinking. Someone had silenced it from the main operations center. The room felt very still. Humans went through ice ages, I said. Not one, several. Periods where the temperature dropped so far that most of the planet became uninhabitable. The species that survived those periods did not survive because they were the strongest or the fastest. They survived because they were the most adaptable. They changed their behavior, their tools, their social structures, their diets. They changed whatever they had to change. And when two groups of surviving humans met at the edge of a glacier, they did not always cooperate. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they did not. And the ones who were still alive 10,000 years later were the ones who had learned to handle both outcomes. Viral set down the tablet very carefully. Then came the diseases, I said. Wave after wave of them, over thousands of years. Plagues that reduced human populations by a third, by half, sometimes more. The survivors were not just lucky. They carried something in their bodies that the dead did not. Resistance. Generation after generation of this produced an immune system that is, by galactic standards, extraordinary. Pathogens that have ended civilizations on other worlds do very little to humans. We have already survived their cousins. I did not know that, Viral said quietly. Most people do not. I picked up my coffee again. It had gone cool, but I drank it anyway. Then came the wars. And this is the part I want you to understand most carefully, Viral, because it is the part that the Galactic Incident Registry does not capture. Humans did not just fight wars. We studied them. We wrote books about them. We developed entire fields of knowledge dedicated to the theory and practice of organized conflict. We named the principles. We argued about the principles. We tested them against each other over and over across centuries. We built institutions specifically designed to prepare for war, to conduct war, to recover from war, and to study what went wrong so that the next war would go better. Viral looked at me as if he was not entirely sure I was real. No other species did that, I said. Not the way we did. Not for that long. With that much commitment, and with that much detailed analysis. By the time humans left our planet for the first time, we had 10,000 years of documented military history behind us. We had studied every failed strategy. We had cataloged every mistake. We had refined the practice of organized conflict into something that looked, to an outside observer, almost like a science. He was very still. And then, I said, we went to the stars. I stood up and walked to the window. The station turned slowly in its orbit, and the stars shifted around us in a long, quiet arc. Somewhere out there, in a system I could not see from here, the Gareth were probably congratulating themselves on a successful operation. They had hit 3 Thesian outposts in a single coordinated action. Clean, efficient, professionally executed. They had done their research, clearly. They had identified a target, assessed the defenses, and moved with precision. But they had not checked the neighbor. 600 years ago, I said. Before the conclave, before any of this, a species called the Vron sent a small fleet to a human coastal settlement on Earth. They had been watching us from a distance and they had made a calculation. Small population, low technology, no visible military presence. They planned to take the people and put them to work. Viral made a very soft sound. The settlement had about 400 people, I said. Farmers, fishermen, traders. People who fixed boats for a living and grew food and raised families. The Vron arrived with 9 ships and what they considered an overwhelming force. I paused. They left with 2 ships. It took them 11 days to leave. When they filed their report afterward, the threat assessment section contained 4 words. Do not engage humans. That was it. No further explanation, just those 4 words underlined twice. Viral stood up slowly. He walked to stand beside me at the window and looked out at the stars. Do you understand what I am telling you? I asked. I think so, he said. His voice was very quiet. I think I am beginning to. Good, I said, because I am only getting started. Outside, the stars turned. The conclave moved through the dark in its long, slow orbit, carrying all of its delegations and all of its fear, and all of its careful diplomatic language and its centuries of records that showed, clearly and without exception, one remarkable, unexplained blank space where the human entry should have been. Nobody had ever filled in that blank space, because nobody had ever been willing to try. That was the point. That had always been the point. I turned away from the window and looked at Viral. He was still staring out at the stars, and on his face was an expression I had never seen there before. It was not fear exactly. It was something more like the feeling you get when you realize that the thing you thought was a shadow is actually a very large, very patient, very quiet animal that has been sitting next to you this entire time, watching you, waiting. Not because it needed anything from you, but simply because it had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world. "Sit down," I said gently. "There is more." He sat down and I began to tell him the real history of the human species, not the version in the diplomatic briefing packets. Not the short summary we gave to new conclave members. The real version, the long one. The one that explained, clearly and without any room for misunderstanding, why that list on his tablet had a blank space where human incidents should have been. By the time I was finished, he would understand. By the time I was finished, he would never look at a human being the same way again. The first thing Viral asked, after I told him to sit down, was whether he should be worried about the Gareth attack or about the conversation he was currently having. I told him honestly that the answer was both, but for very different reasons, and that by the end of what I was about to tell him, he would understand the difference clearly. He folded his hands on the table. He had a habit of doing that when he was preparing himself to listen carefully. I had noticed it in conclave sessions, when the debates got complicated and the translation software started struggling with tone. He would fold his hands and go very still, and let everything come in without reacting, processing it all in that quiet, layered way Thescians had. I respected that about him. I started with the ice, metaphorical ice, actual ice. 40,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries, the human species was not the dominant form of life on the planet. There were large predators. There were environmental pressures. There were competing populations of the same species moving across continents and into territories that other populations already occupied. The temperature had been dropping for thousands of years. The northern and southern regions of the planet were becoming uninhabitable. Resources were shrinking. Most species under those conditions collapse. The population drops. The gene pool narrows. The survivors cling to whatever is left and hope the pressure eventually eases. Humans did something different. They invented tools, not simple tools, complex, specialized tools designed for specific tasks. Needles for sewing animal hides into insulated clothing. Spear points designed to penetrate the thick hide of large cold-weather animals. Storage systems for food. Fire management techniques. And they did not just use these tools. They refined them. They passed the knowledge down. They argued about which methods were better and tested the arguments through use, discarding what failed and keeping what worked. But the most important thing they invented during those long, cold centuries was not a physical tool. It was a social one. They invented specialization. In most animal groups, every individual performs roughly the same tasks. Everybody hunts. Everybody forages. Everybody builds shelter. Specialization, where one individual focuses on one skill and trades the product of that skill with others, is not a natural evolutionary outcome. It requires trust. It requires a degree of social complexity that most species never develop, because the risk of trusting another individual with a vital function is very high. Humans developed it anyway, not because they were particularly trusting, but because they were smart enough to understand that a group with a dedicated toolmaker, a dedicated tracker, a dedicated healer, and a dedicated strategist was more effective than a group where everyone did everything poorly. They overcame the trust problem not by becoming more trusting but by developing systems to enforce agreements. Social pressure, reputation, consequence for defection. In other words, they developed law, informally at first, rules, norms, expectations, the mechanisms for punishing people who broke the agreement and rewarding people who kept it. This was not kindness. This was engineering. Human social structures, from the very beginning, were built on a clear-eyed understanding of the fact that other humans were dangerous, and that the only way to get useful things from them without being harmed was to build systems that made harm unprofitable. Viral interrupted me at that point. He said, "That sounds like what all species do." I shook my head. "The difference is the scale and the duration," I told him, "and what it produced over time. Other species developed social cooperation. Humans developed adversarial cooperation. They cooperated with people they did not trust, did not like, and actively competed with, because the framework of rules they had built made cooperation more profitable than conflict in specific contexts. They could work beside someone they considered an enemy and follow the agreement perfectly, not because they felt goodwill toward that person, but because they had calculated that honoring the agreement served their interests better than breaking it. That specific capability, adversarial cooperation, was something I had never seen in any other species at the Conclave. Every other civilization that achieved space travel did so because they eventually reached a point of genuine internal harmony. The dangerous period of internal conflict ended, and then the cooperative period began. And then they looked outward. They arrived in the galaxy as fundamentally peaceful peoples, carrying the memory of conflict but not its active practice. Humans arrived still doing it, not with weapons drawn, not aggressively, but the internal mechanisms that had been built over 40,000 years of surviving each other did not simply switch off because the environment had changed. They were still there, fully operational, just redirected. Viral was very still. He had unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the table. I noticed that. I moved forward to the diseases. The first waves came before recorded history. Pathogens moving through populations that had no resistance, no medicine, no understanding of what was happening to them. Only the experience of watching people get sick and die, and the desperate attempt to find a response. The populations that survived those early waves did so partly through behavior, isolating the sick, moving away from contaminated areas, and partly through biology. The survivors carried something: immunity, partial immunity, a body that fought back harder. Then the waves came again. Different pathogens, new strains. Each time the survivors passed their resistance on. Each time, the human immune system got slightly better at recognizing and responding to biological threats. This was not a comfortable process. It was a catastrophic one. Some events reduced human populations by enormous percentages. The survivors often had nothing left: no food, no shelter, no functioning social structure. They had to rebuild from almost nothing repeatedly, over thousands of years. That rebuilding process did something important. It forced constant adaptation. Humans who were psychologically rigid, who could not function in the absence of familiar structures, did not survive the rebuilding periods as well as humans who could tolerate chaos, improvise solutions, and build new systems from scratch. Generation after generation of this produced a species that was, at a very deep level, comfortable with disruption, not happy about it, not glad when things fell apart, but capable of functioning through it in a way that other species, with more stable histories, were not. I told Viral about the bacterial infections that had killed entire armies in some historical periods, forcing a sudden change in how soldiers were housed and supplied, which produced modern theories of field medicine and logistics that were still in use in modified form in human military doctrine today. I told him about the viral events that had reshaped entire civilizations, producing social changes, religious movements, and institutional reforms that altered the course of human history. Each catastrophe had produced a response. Each response had made the species slightly harder. Humans do not see these events as tragedies only, I said. We see them as that, yes. We grieve, we remember. We build monuments and hold ceremonies, but we also study them, we analyze them. We document exactly what happened and why, and what the response was, and what worked and what did not. We keep the knowledge. We add it to the body of things humans know about surviving terrible events. And the next generation starts with that knowledge already in hand. Viral said, every species does that. To a degree, I said. But consider the volume, consider the duration, and consider what happens to the institutional knowledge when the institution almost collapses and has to be rebuilt. Human knowledge survived that process repeatedly. Not perfectly, there were losses. Dark periods where knowledge was scattered and had to be rediscovered. But enough survived, enough times, that the cumulative body of human knowledge about how to endure catastrophic events is larger than that of any other species in this conclave by a significant margin. We have had more practice. I paused and let that settle, then I told him about the wars. Not one war. Not a handful of wars. Thousands of years of continuous, documented, studied, analyzed conflict between human groups. Wars over territory. Wars over resources. Wars over beliefs, ideas, and symbols. Wars that started for reasons that seemed absurd in hindsight, and consumed entire generations before they ended. Wars that ended, and then started again in slightly different form 20 years later. And through all of it, two things happened simultaneously. The first was that human military capability became extraordinarily sophisticated, not just in terms of weapons, though weapons developed too, but in terms of doctrine, strategy, logistics, intelligence, the study of conflict as a discipline. Humans wrote manuals about how to move large numbers of people across difficult terrain efficiently. They wrote analyses of famous battles, studying exactly what the commanders had done and what they should have done differently. They built institutions specifically designed to train people in the theory and practice of organized conflict. They ran simulations. They war-gamed scenarios that had not happened yet, trying to anticipate and prepare for every possible situation. By the time humans reached space, they had a body of military knowledge that was 10,000 years old and constantly updated. Every mistake was cataloged. Every successful innovation was studied and reproduced. The human military tradition was not a thing that had been invented at some point and then preserved. It was a living, growing, constantly self-correcting discipline that had never stopped developing, because the conflicts that drove it had never fully stopped. The second thing that happened was harder to see but more important. The human character was shaped by all of it, not hardened in the sense of becoming cruel. That would have been simpler and, honestly, less interesting. Humans did not come out of their history as a cold or brutal people. They came out of it as something much stranger. They came out of it capable of enormous warmth and enormous resolve in the same breath, capable of sitting with a friend in a quiet room and having a gentle conversation about history while simultaneously being, at a level that required no effort or preparation, entirely ready to do whatever was necessary to protect that friend if the situation demanded it. The switch between those two states did not feel like a switch to a human. It felt like the same thing expressed differently. Care, expressed in peace, looked like warmth. Care, expressed under threat, looked like something the galaxy had learned not to provoke. Viral had been quiet for a long time, he said. When the Vron left after the incident you described, they said 4 words. Do not engage humans. Did they ever explain why? Did they ever write more than that? They did, I said. The full report is much longer. I have read it. The threat assessment section, after the 4-word summary, goes on for 11 pages. It describes in detail what the Vron observed during those 11 days. It describes how the people in that settlement responded to the initial contact, how quickly they reorganized after the first shock, how they communicated with each other, how they used the terrain, how they adapted their approach when the first response did not work, how they maintained cohesion under pressure, how some of them did things that, in the Vron analysis, made no rational sense from a survival optimization standpoint. What things? Viral asked. They put themselves in danger to protect others, I said. Not family members, not close companions, strangers, people they had perhaps spoken to a few times, whose names they might not have known well. They did things that increased their own risk significantly in order to reduce the risk for someone else. The Vron analyst who wrote that section of the report used the word irrational 4 times in 2 paragraphs. Is it irrational? Viral asked. By some definitions, I said. By others, it is the most rational thing imaginable, because a group where individuals are willing to accept personal cost to protect the group is a far more effective fighting unit than a group where every individual is only protecting themselves. The Vron saw individual acts of apparent irrationality. What they were actually seeing was the product of a culture that had spent thousands of years in figuring out, through trial and catastrophic error, that groups who held together under pressure outlasted groups who did not. I stood up and walked to the window again. There is a concept in human military history, I said, called the last stand. It refers to a situation where a group of fighters, heavily outnumbered and with no realistic prospect of winning the engagement, chooses to hold their position anyway, to keep fighting, not because they believe they can win, but because they have decided that the cost of taking that position must be made as high as possible, regardless of the personal consequence. The station turned slowly. The stars shifted. The Keth do not have a word for this concept, I said. When I looked it up in their language, the closest translation was a phrase that meant pointless dying. They genuinely could not understand why a group that had already lost would continue to resist. In Keth doctrine, once the outcome of an engagement is clearly determined, the rational response is to accept the outcome and minimize further loss. Continued resistance at that point is, to them, simply a failure of logical assessment. I turned around. But that framing misses something important, I said. The human last stand is not irrational. It is a message. It is a statement delivered to whoever is doing the attacking. It says, we know what this costs. We are paying it anyway. And anyone who comes after us will know exactly what it cost you. That message has strategic value that extends far beyond the immediate engagement. It tells every future aggressor that the cost of taking human territory is never zero, never quick, and never clean. It tells them that there will always be people who hold the line, even when holding the line looks hopeless. And it tells them that the accounting for that cost does not end when the engagement ends. Viral looked at me for a long moment. His 4 eyes were very still. You said earlier, he spoke carefully, that humans are kind. We are, I said. And yet, I agreed. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, I have worked beside you for 3 years. I have had dinner with you. We have argued about conclave procedural rules and laughed about the translation errors. And you helped me when my delegation was going through that difficult period last spring. You are one of the most reasonable people I know. Thank you, I said. And everything you are telling me, he said, makes me feel as though I have been sitting next to something very large without realizing it. That is, I said, a very accurate description of the experience. Outside, the conclave continued its long orbit. Somewhere in the building, other delegations were still in their emergency sessions, planning, debating, worrying about the Garath. Nobody had come to ask the human delegation for a statement yet. That would come later. It always did. I sat back down across from Viral and folded my hands on the table in a way that I had picked up, without realizing it, from watching him do it. We are not finished, I said. There is more you need to understand. About the first contact incidents. About what happened when other species decided to test the edges. About what the Keth did 60 years ago, and what came after, and why the Keth ambassador who just walked through the station an hour ago gave me a nod that looked like the one you give to a creature you respect very much, and have absolutely no interest in disturbing. Viral straightened in his chair. Tell me, he said, so I told him. The incident with the Keth started simply, the way most of the truly significant moments in galactic history start, with someone making a calculation that seemed reasonable at the time and turned out to be catastrophically wrong. The year was 53 years ago. By conclave standard reckoning, the location was a human deep space mining colony called Corden Station, which was not a glamorous name for a place and was not a glamorous place to live. It sat in the outer belt of a system that had no habitable planets, just a yellow sun, a lot of rock, and significant deposits of several minerals that human industry needed in large quantities. The station had about 300 people. Miners, engineers, support staff, a small medical team, a few administrators. It was the kind of place where people went to earn a salary for 2 years and then went home. The Keth chose it because it appeared, by every measure they used, to be a soft target. The Keth were, and still are, the most feared raiding species in this region of the galaxy. They were not the largest, and they were not the most technologically advanced, but they had developed a raiding doctrine over several centuries that was extremely effective. They identified targets with low defensive capacity, moved quickly, overwhelmed the location before any response force could arrive, took what they wanted in terms of resources and population, and departed. The entire operation from arrival to departure usually took between 18 and 40 hours. They had executed this type of operation hundreds of times against dozens of species. Their success rate was very high. Their losses were consistently low. When the Keth fleet arrived at Corden Station, they brought 940 fighters in 14 ships, against a population of 300 civilians with no standing military presence and no dedicated defensive weaponry. This was not considered a contested engagement by Keth doctrine. It was considered a retrieval operation. The only variables were efficiency and timing. The operation did not go the way the Keth expected. I want to be precise about what happened, because the precise details matter. The 300 people at Corden Station were not trained soldiers. They did not have military equipment. They had mining tools, engineering supplies, maintenance equipment, communication systems, and 3 years of accumulated detailed knowledge of every tunnel, shaft, corridor, access point, ventilation route, and structural weakness in the station. Within the first 2 hours of the Keth arrival, the station's chief engineer, a woman named Helen Bryce, had convened an informal coordination group using the maintenance communication channel, which ran on a completely different system from the main station comms that the Keth had immediately jammed. The Keth did not know this channel existed. It was used normally to coordinate repair work and schedule equipment maintenance. On this day, it was used to coordinate a defense. Helen Bryce was 41 years old. She had spent 15 years in deep space engineering. She had never been in a combat situation in her life. In the first communication she sent over that channel, she said clearly and without any apparent panic, "We know this station better than they do. That is our advantage. We are going to use it completely." What followed over the next 6 days was one of the most remarkable asymmetric engagements in documented galactic history. And I say that knowing full well how much documented galactic history there is. The miners rerouted ventilation systems to push non-breathable atmospheric mixes into corridors, where Keth forces were massing. using the station's own environmental control systems in ways that were not their designed purpose, but were entirely within their technical capability. They sealed and unsealed sections remotely to control where the Keth could and could not move, turning the station into a maze that kept shifting. They used the heavy mining equipment, which had been designed to break apart asteroid rock, as improvised weapons in contexts where the Keth had no frame of reference for how to respond to a drilling rig being used offensively. They communicated constantly. Every person who learned something about what the Keth were doing passed that information through the maintenance channel immediately. The group adapted. When one approach stopped working, they tried another. When a section of the station was lost, they sealed it off and found a different route. They did not panic when things went wrong. They noted what went wrong, adjusted, and continued. On the fourth day, a group of 12 Keth fighters cornered a small team of 4 humans in a dead-end section near the station's reactor access corridor. By Keth doctrine, the engagement was over. The cornered group had no exit, no reinforcement, and no realistic defensive option. The Keth commander leading that group sent a message back to the fleet command, reporting the capture of 4 humans and requesting extraction orders. The message he sent 14 minutes later was different. It reported that his group had suffered significant losses in the dead-end corridor and was requesting medical support. He did not explain in that message what the 4 humans had done. The Keth tactical analysis conducted afterward determined that the humans had used the reactor access corridor's own safety systems, which they had complete knowledge of, and the Keth had none, to create a situation that was extremely costly for the attacking force. 2 of the 4 humans did not survive the encounter. The Keth lost 8 fighters. From a purely mathematical standpoint, the exchange favored the Keth, but mathematics was not the only thing being communicated. What was communicated was this: that the humans in that corridor had made a calculation about how to do the most possible damage in a situation where they had already assessed their own survival chances as very low. And they had executed that plan without hesitation. They had not tried to negotiate. They had not tried to surrender. They had used everything available to them to make the cost of that corridor as high as possible. The Keth Fleet Command reviewed the numbers on day 5. 14 ships, 940 fighters, against 300 civilians with no military training. And the casualty count was moving in a direction that the Keth doctrine did not have a category for. By day 5, they had sustained over 370 casualties. The station was still operational. The 300 people were still functioning, still communicating, still adapting. The Keth withdrew on day 6. They left without taking a single person and without securing a single resource deposit. Their fleet returned to Keth space with just under 60% of the force they had arrived with. The official report filed by the fleet commander was studied by every major intelligence service in this region of the galaxy within 2 years of its publication. The threat assessment section was 11 pages long and concluded with a recommendation that was adopted as standing Keth policy within 6 months of the report's acceptance. The recommendation was to classify human-occupied territory as a no-engagement zone for all standard raiding operations, pending the development of a dedicated strategy capable of addressing the specific challenges human targets presented. That dedicated strategy was never developed, not because the Keth lacked the intelligence to develop it, but because every wargaming exercise they ran, using their best analysts and their most experienced commanders, produced outcomes that were unacceptable. The problem was not the weapons. The problem was not the numbers. The problem was the people. You could not predict human response reliably enough to build a strategy around it. The Keth ran models. They built simulations. They adjusted variables. Every time the simulation produced the same note in the analyst's final column. Response profile, non-linear. Strategic planning, insufficient data. After 7 years of trying, the Keth formally abandoned the project. The no-engagement classification became permanent. I told Viral all of this in detail. He listened the way he always listened in serious moments, completely still, hands flat on the table, his 4 eyes fixed on me without blinking for long periods. When I finished the account of Cordon Station, he was quiet for almost a full minute. 300 people, he finally said. 300 people, I confirmed. Non-military, completely non-military, against nearly 1,000 trained fighters. Yes, he looked down at his hands. And 2 of them in that corridor made a choice to spend themselves as expensively as possible. Yes, knowing what would happen. Yes, he looked up at me. Why? Not tactically. I understand the tactical logic. But what were they feeling in that moment? What does a human feel in that moment? I thought about how to answer that honestly. Different things, I said. depending on the person. Some of them are afraid. Most of them are afraid, actually. That does not stop them. Some of them are angry. Some of them reach a point where the calculation becomes very simple, and the simplicity is almost a relief. The complexity goes away. There is one thing to do, do it well. Make it count. That does not sound like a peaceful species, Viral said. We are not a peaceful species, I said. We are a species that chooses peace when peace serves the people we care about. The choice is genuine, but it is a choice, not a nature. Viral was quiet again. I want to tell you about the intelligence files, I said, because they explain something important about why that list on your tablet is blank. He nodded. The files I was referring to were classified documents maintained by 5 different species, including the Keth and the Vran, that were specifically dedicated to the analysis of human capabilities, behaviors, and response patterns. I had become aware of their existence through a contact in Conclave Intelligence Services about 18 months into my posting here. I had subsequently, through channels I will not detail, obtained summary access to 3 of them. They were fascinating documents. Each one had been compiled over many decades by analysts who were genuinely trying to understand what they were looking at. They cataloged human history, human biology, human psychology, and human military doctrine in exhaustive detail. They cross-referenced incidents. They built behavioral models. They ran projections. And every single one of them, in the final risk assessment section, regardless of the species that had written it, and regardless of their starting assumptions, arrived at the same conclusion. The language differed depending on the translation, but the meaning was consistent. Do not initiate conflict with humans. The cost-benefit analysis does not support it. The reason was not, as many species seem to assume, that humans were impossible to hurt. They were not. The reason was not that humans had the largest fleet or the most advanced weapons. They did not, though they were not far behind on either count. The reason was something the analysts kept circling back to, in different sections of the documents. Always slightly frustrated, as if they were trying to describe a color that did not exist in their visual spectrum. Human response to aggression was non-proportional and non-terminating. What that meant was this. When another species was attacked, the response was generally calculated according to a set of factors: the severity of the attack, the cost of the response, the likelihood of success, and the point at which the cost of continued resistance exceeded the value of what was being defended. At that point, the rational course was to accept terms or disengage. Most galactic conflicts operated within this framework. It was why wars ended. Both sides eventually reached a point where continued conflict was more expensive than stopping, and they stopped. Humans operated within this framework in ordinary circumstances, but the framework had an exception that no other species had built into their behavior at the same depth, and the exception was this: harm the people they cared about, and the calculation changed entirely. Not the numbers in the calculation, the nature of the calculation. When human populations experienced significant loss at the hands of an external aggressor, the cost-benefit framework did not disappear, but the value of the thing being defended changed. It was no longer just territory or resources or strategic position. It became something that the Keth analyst who wrote about it described, with evident bewilderment, as unquantifiable emotional priority. The humans were no longer fighting for a definable objective. They were fighting for a principle. And a principle, unlike a territory, does not have a point at which defending it costs more than it is worth, because its worth is not denominated in the same currency as the cost. This made human populations extraordinarily difficult to defeat in any final sense. You could win every engagement. You could take every objective. You could push them back to their last position and take that too. And they would still be organizing the next response. Not because they were irrational, but because the thing driving the response was not the kind of thing that running out of resources or losing battles could address. You could not take away what was motivating them by winning. You could only make it stronger. I told Viral this. He listened all the way through without interrupting, which for a Thessian, during a long explanation, was unusual. When I finished, he said, "So the species that looked at all of this and decided never to provoke humans have made a rational calculation." "Yes," I said, "because the potential cost is open-ended and the potential gain is fixed." "Exactly. And the species that have not looked at it carefully enough," he said slowly, "or that have looked at it and decided they were different, that they had found an angle the others missed, have all received the same education." "Every time," I said, without exception. He folded his hands again. "What happened to the Narathi?" he asked. I had been waiting for him to ask that question. 60 years ago, I said. The Narathi Empire. which was at that time expanding along what they considered their natural territorial boundary, destroyed a human colony transport in transit. The ship was carrying 15,000 people, families, children, people who were relocating to a new colony. The Narathi claimed afterward that it was a misidentification, that they had believed the vessel to be something else. They issued a formal statement of regret through diplomatic channels. Viral was very still. The human government received the statement, I said. They acknowledged it. They did not respond with any immediate military action. The diplomatic community, including several species in this conclave, noted this and concluded that the matter was being handled through proper channels and would likely result in a negotiated settlement. I paused. 18 months later, I said, the human fleet, which had been quietly assembled and positioned over the preceding year and a half, while the diplomatic process was ongoing, arrived at the outer boundary of Narathi space. Every ship that the human military services could field. They made no demands. They sent no ultimatum. They arrived and they waited. Viral said nothing. The Narathi government sent an inquiry, I said, asking the nature of the visit. The human fleet commander's response was exactly 14 words long. We are here regarding the matter of the colony transport. We will wait for your answer. The Narathi government asked what the question was. The fleet commander said there was no question. There was only an accounting. I let that sit in the air. The Narathi surrendered within a week, I said. The terms they accepted included full acknowledgement of responsibility, a reparations agreement that significantly impacted their economy, and a formal revision of their territorial claim that pushed their boundary well away from human space. The terms were not cruel. They were not designed to destroy the Narathi. They were designed to be exactly as painful as the Narathi could bear, for exactly as long as it took to change the calculation for every future Narathi government that might consider a similar action. And has any Narathi government considered it since? Viral asked. Not once, I said. He uncrossed his fingers and placed his palms flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked up at me. You said earlier, he said, that humans name their warships after battles they lost. Yes. Why? Because we do not want to forget, I said. Because the names are a reminder. Every crew that serves on a ship named for a defeat understands something that is not written in any manual. They understand that the defeat is unfinished, that the story did not end there, that they are part of what comes after. That is, Viral said carefully, a very particular way to think about loss. Yes, I said. It is. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, is it true that some of those names are very old? That there are human warships named for events that happened centuries ago? Yes, I said. The oldest active name in the human fleet is for an event that happened nearly 400 years ago. The ship that carries that name is one of the most decorated vessels in current service. The crew considers it an honor to serve on her. Viral nodded slowly. He seemed to be working something out in his mind. So when someone attacks a human world, he said, they are not just fighting the people who are there. They are, in some sense, fighting everyone who has come before. That is, I said, a very precise way to put it. The door to the briefing room opened. One of the conclave's administrative staff leaned in and informed us that the full emergency session was convening in 20 minutes. All delegations were required to attend. The Gareth situation had escalated. New information had come in. The staff member left. The door slid closed. Viral stood up. He straightened his formal coat and adjusted the Thessian diplomatic insignia at his collar. Then he looked at me. I want to ask you one more thing, he said. Go ahead. The Keth commander I saw in the corridor this morning, he said. The senior one. He looked at you and he stopped, and he was very still for a moment, and then he walked away. Yes, I said. What was that? I thought about it. Recognition, I said. The Keth learn it young now. There are training materials. The incident at Cordon Station is required study in their military academies. The whole series of documented contacts is. I paused. It is the same feeling you get when you pass something in the wilderness that you know is dangerous. You do not run. You do not provoke it. You walk past calmly, and you do not make eye contact, and you keep moving, and you feel grateful that it did not decide you were worth its attention today. Viral looked at me for a long moment. And are we, he asked, worth your attention, the Thessians? Have you decided we are allies worth protecting? Yes, I said without hesitating. 3 years of working beside you was enough to decide that. He held my gaze. Something shifted in his expression. Then the Gareth, he said quietly, have made a very serious mistake. Yes, I said. They have. We walked toward the door. I want to be honest about the moment I knew the situation had shifted from serious to something that required a different kind of attention. It was when Commander Ruth Aldridge walked into the emergency session room. set her briefing materials on the table without looking at anyone, and sat down. Ruth Aldridge was not a dramatic person. She was 54 years old, had served in the human military services for 31 of those years, and had the quality that the best senior officers tend to develop over long careers, which is the quality of being completely calm in proportion to how complicated things have become. She was calmest when things were at their worst. It was not a performance. It was simply how she was built by this point. The calculation of what was serious and what was very serious, and what required the deepest kind of attention happened somewhere behind her eyes, quickly and without visible output. And what you saw on the surface was always the same, measured, focused, present. When she set down those briefing materials without looking at anyone, I recognized the particular quality of her stillness. I had seen it once before, during a border dispute 2 years ago that had been resolved without incident. At that time, she had sat in exactly that way for about 40 minutes while the diplomatic teams argued, and then she had made 2 phone calls and the incident had ended. I did not know what calls she was making now. The emergency session convened with every delegation present. The conclave chair ran through the situation as known. 3 Theshan research outposts in the outer boundary region had been hit simultaneously. The Gareth, who had made contact with the conclave only 14 months ago, and had been in a provisional observation status since then, had conducted what appeared to be a coordinated military operation. Casualties among the outpost personnel were significant. 2 of the 3 stations were no longer operational. The reactions around the table were what I expected. The Doral delegation expressed formal outrage. The Sureth asked for clarification on whether the Gareth had violated any treaty provisions, and since the Gareth were in observation status and had signed no treaties, the answer was technically no, which the Sureth found both alarming and inconvenient. The Keth delegation, seated 3 positions to my left, said nothing for the first 20 minutes of the session, and then made a very brief statement indicating that they would be reviewing their own border positions in light of the new information. I watched Ruth Aldridge through all of this. She was reading something on her data tablet. She was also listening. I could tell because she would look up occasionally at whoever was speaking, absorb what they were saying, and return to the tablet. She was doing 2 things at once, both completely, which was a capability I had admired in her from our first meeting. Viral's delegation made their formal statement. It was a model of controlled distress. They described the outposts, the people who had been stationed there, the nature of the research being conducted. They described the attack with precision and without inflammatory language. They asked the conclave for a formal acknowledgement that the Gareth action was a violation of provisional status conditions, and for a recommendation on how to proceed. Then they did something I had not fully expected, though I probably should have. Viral looked down the table at the human delegation and said, formally for the record, the Theshan delegation requests that the human delegation indicate whether it considers this matter one of shared concern, given the long-standing cooperative relationship between our peoples and the formal mutual assistance framework set established 4 years ago. Every head in the room turned toward the human delegation. Ruth Aldridge looked up from her tablet. She looked at Viral. She looked at me briefly, with an expression that was entirely neutral, and somehow communicated everything. Then she looked back at Viral. The human delegation, she said, in the same unhurried tone she used for everything, considers this matter one of shared concern. The mutual assistance framework applies. We are already in contact with relevant command authorities. She looked back down at her tablet. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then the Doral delegate said something in their own language that the translation system rendered as "I see," which I suspected was a significant understatement. The Sureth delegation leaned together and exchanged several rapid words. The Keth delegation remained expressionless, but the senior Keth diplomat picked up his own communication device and held it in a way that suggested he was about to use it. I looked at Viral. He met my eyes across the table. There was something in his expression that I recognized from our conversation earlier. That quality of adjusting to a new understanding of the dimensions of something. The session continued. Other delegations made statements. Proposals were offered about diplomatic contact with the Gareth, about formal censure, about requests for explanation. The machinery of the conclave moved in its careful procedural way. Ruth Aldridge participated minimally. She answered questions directly when asked. She offered no editorializing. She did not raise her voice or express urgency. She was the calmest person in the room, and because of that, she was also in some way the most present. After the session, In the corridor outside, the senior Keth diplomat passed me walking in the opposite direction. He stopped. This was unusual. Keth diplomats at the conclave did not generally initiate conversation with human representatives. They were not unfriendly, exactly. They were simply very careful about the impression they gave. Very measured. Very aware of the record. He stopped and he looked at me, and he said in very precise conclave standard language, "I have sent a communication to a contact who may be in a position to reach the Gareth High Command." I waited. "The communication," he said, "advises them to review the documentation regarding Cordon Station and several subsequent incidents before determining their next course of action. It includes the full text of my service's threat assessment file." "That was thoughtful of you," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "We have had 53 years to think about Cordon Station," he said. "The lessons were not comfortable, but they were clear." He held my gaze for a beat. "I hope they receive the communication in time for it to be useful." He walked away. I stood in the corridor for a moment and thought about that. Then I went to find Ruth Aldridge. She was in the Human Delegation's operations room, which was not a large space but was always organized with a precision that I found reassuring. 2 staff members were at terminals. A communications officer was running a channel I recognized as the encrypted military link. Ruth was standing at the main table with a display in front of her, looking at fleet position data. She heard me come in. She did not look up immediately. She finished what she was reading, then she looked up. "Close the door," she said. I closed the door. "The Gareth," she said, "have 17 systems in their current territorial range. They are an expanding civilization aggressive in the manner of species who discovered that expansion worked before they encountered serious resistance. Their fleet doctrine is what I would call optimistic. They have had very few reverses, and it shows in how they plan." "How did you get this much information this quickly?" I asked. "We have been watching them since they made contact with the conclave," she said simply. "That is standard practice for any new contact, particularly one that shows early signs of the expansion pattern." "They showed those signs 14 months ago?" "They showed them on the day they arrived," she said. "The way they positioned their ships during the initial contact. The questions they asked about territorial boundaries. The specific systems they inquired about. The pattern was recognizable." She looked at the display. "We have been patient." I sat down in one of the chairs along the wall. "What happens now?" "Now," she said, "they receive communication from several directions. From the conclave formally. From the Keth, which will surprise them. From us, through back channels, which will tell them clearly what the mutual assistance framework means in practical terms, and give them an opportunity to make a different choice. And if they do not make a different choice," she looked at me steadily, "then they will learn what the Narathi learned. What the Keth learned. What the Vron learned many years before any of the recent incidents." She paused. "We do not want that outcome. It is wasteful. The Garath are a young civilization. They could be something much better than what they have chosen to be so far. Young civilizations often change course when they understand the terrain accurately. And if they do not change course, then we make the cost of continuing on their current course very high," she said, with the same quiet matter-of-factness she used to discuss fleet positions and communication protocols. "High enough that every civilization that comes after them and faces the same choice will have a very clear reference point for what happens when you pick the wrong neighbors to pressure." She looked back at her display. "The Theshian outpost personnel," she said. "The ones who were injured in the attack. We have medical ships that can reach them in 40 hours. I have already authorized the deployment." "Viral will want to know that," I said. "Tell him," she said. "And tell him that the Human Delegation's mutual assistance framework fully active, and that the Theshian delegation can include that in any formal communication they wish to send to the Gareth through conclave channels." I stood up to leave. "One more thing," she said. I stopped. "Your Theshian colleague," she said. "Viral. The conversation you had with him this morning." She looked at me. There was no accusation in her expression, just observation. "I think so," I said. "He needed to understand the full picture." She nodded. "It is important," she said, "that the people who stand beside us know what that means. Not because we want them to be afraid of us, but because understanding changes how they approach the relationship. They stop expecting us to be something we are not. They stop being surprised." She paused. "And they stop making the mistake of assuming that our patience is the same as our limit." "He does not think that anymore," I said. "Good," she said, and looked back at her display. I left the operations room and went back to the main corridor. The next 3 days at the conclave moved the way important things move when you are inside them. which is slowly in the waiting and very fast in the acting, with long silences in between that are filled with more work than the silences suggest. The Garath High Command received communication from the conclave chair. They also received the Keth transmission, which caused, according to a second-hand account I received 48 hours later, a significant internal debate among their senior military leadership. They received back-channel communication from the human delegation, which was courteous in language, specific in content, and left no room for misreading. I spent a lot of those 3 days with Viral. He was processing. I recognized the signs because I had seen other people go through the same thing. After learning something that fundamentally changed how they understood a situation they had been living inside, he would start a conversation on one topic and end it on a different one. He would fall quiet in the middle of sentences, not because he had lost the thread, but because something had caught his attention internally, and he needed a moment to look at it. On the morning of the second day, he asked me something that I had not expected. He said, "Do you find it lonely?" I looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Knowing what you know," he said, "about your own species. Knowing that the reason other civilizations leave you alone is not because they feel warmly toward you. It is because they have done the calculation and found the risk unacceptable." He was looking out the window at the station's exterior. You are safe because you are considered dangerous, not because you are trusted. Does that not feel lonely? I thought about it seriously, because he had asked it seriously. Sometimes, I said, there is a version of it that feels lonely, yes. When you realize that the respect in certain quarters is not the kind that comes from genuine regard, but from a kind of careful distance. That is a specific feeling. I paused. But there is another version. The relationships that are genuine, that are chosen freely, that exist because someone like you decided to sit across the table from someone like me and actually try to understand each other. Those feel different. Those do not feel lonely at all. He was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you told me. About the 2 people in the corridor at Cordon Station, the ones who made the decision they made." "Yes, they were protecting the others," he said. 300 people defending the station. Those 2 people looked at the situation and decided to spend everything they had to protect the other 298, and they did it knowing the cost. "Yes," I said. "And the whole species," he said slowly, "in some sense works like that. Not because every individual has made a conscious decision to be that way, but because that is what the culture has built, that when it matters, people choose each other." "Yes," I said. "That is a good way to put it." He turned to look at me. "I think that is why the warmth is real," he said. "It is not separate from the other thing. It is the same thing, the same capacity, expressed in different directions." I looked at him and felt something that I usually tried to keep separate from my professional responsibilities at the conclave, which was a genuine affection for this particular person, and a gratitude that the galaxy had produced someone like him who thought carefully about things and arrived at true conclusions. "Yes," I said, "you have understood it exactly." On the 3rd day, the Garath responded. They sent a formal communication to the conclave, acknowledging the incidents. They requested a direct diplomatic channel to the Thessian delegation. They indicated a willingness to negotiate reparations. They also, in a section near the end of the communication that was technically a separate addendum, but that every experienced diplomat reading it understood was the most important part, formally requested a meeting with the human delegation. Not with the conclave chair. Not with any of the larger species who had made statements in the emergency session. With the human delegation specifically. Ruth Aldridge received the request. She reviewed it. She sent a reply that agreed to the meeting and provided a time and location. Then she called me into the operations room and said, "You have done good work this week. I want you in the room for this meeting." "What do you expect them to want?" I asked. "The same thing everyone wants when they have just realized they have made a mistake," she said. "They want to know how bad it is and whether there is a path out of it that preserves their dignity and their future options." "And is there?" "Yes," she said. "There usually is, if people are willing to accept reality early enough." She looked at the display. "The question is always whether they are the kind of people who can do that. Some civilizations are. Some are not. We will find out which kind the Garath are." On the day of the meeting, I walked with Ruth Aldridge and 2 other senior delegation members down the main corridor of the conclave to a conference room near the center of the station. The Garath delegation was already there. 3 of them, in formal attire, seated on one side of the table, with the careful posture of people who had spent a long time preparing for something they were not entirely sure how to handle. They were a striking species. Tall, angular, with a coloring that shifted slightly depending on their angle to the light. They had been expanding for several decades. They were used to being the most significant presence in whatever room they occupied. The room was not large. Ruth Aldridge sat down across from them without ceremony, placed her materials on the table, and looked at them directly. There was a silence. The lead Gareth diplomat said, in careful conclave standard, "We appreciate the human delegation agreeing to this meeting." "Of course," Ruth said. Another silence. "We are," the diplomat said, attempting to fully understand the implications of the current situation. "I can help with that," Ruth said. She was entirely calm. She always was. "The current situation is as follows. You have struck facilities associated with a species that falls under a mutual assistance framework with the human government. That framework is now active. The response to its activation is a matter of current planning." The Gareth diplomat's coloring shifted very slightly. "We were not," he said carefully, "aware of the full scope of the framework when we made our operational decisions." "I understand," Ruth said. "That is a common issue with new conclave members. The documentation is extensive." She paused. "This is why we wanted to speak with you directly. We prefer clarity to misunderstanding, when misunderstanding can be avoided." "What?" Diplomat said. "Would clarity look like in this situation?" Ruth looked at him with an expression that I had come to think of as her working expression. Attentive, focused, clear. "It would look like this," she said. "The Thessian delegation is prepared to negotiate a settlement through conclave channels. That settlement will include reparations, a formal acknowledgement of the violations, and a revised understanding of territorial boundaries in the affected regions. If those negotiations proceed in good faith and reach a satisfactory conclusion, the mutual assistance framework activation is addressed through that process. And if the negotiations do not proceed," the diplomat said, "then we discuss the alternative," Ruth said simply. "But I would like to spend our time today on the first option, because it is better for everyone, including you." The Gareth diplomat looked at his colleagues for a moment. Then he looked back at Ruth. "We are," he said, "prepared to negotiate in good faith." "Good," Ruth said, and she opened her materials and they began. I sat along the wall and watched. I had been in many meetings at the conclave. Negotiations, briefings, emergency sessions, quiet back-channel conversations. I had seen Ruth Aldridge work before, but there was something about this particular meeting, in this particular moment, that felt different to me. The Gareth delegation had come into that room expecting something. I was not entirely sure what. Something that matched their internal narrative of what the situation was, perhaps. A confrontation, or a threat, or a demand. Something they could position themselves against. What they found was Ruth Aldridge, who was unhurried and clear, and completely without drama, walking them carefully and precisely through exactly what reality looked like, and what their options were within it. No raised voice, no intimidation, no theatrical display. Just the facts, laid out in order, with the same calm she brought to everything. And I noticed something happen across the table. Slowly, over the course of the meeting, the Gareth delegation began to relax. Not because they were being handled softly. Not because Ruth was being anything other than completely honest about the stakes. But because a person who is honest with you in a crisis, who does not use the crisis to perform power, but instead uses it to actually solve the problem, produces a specific response in anyone reasonable enough to recognize it. It produces trust. By the end of the meeting, the framework for the Thessian negotiation was roughed out. The Gareth had agreed to open channels with the Thessian delegation by the next morning. The human delegation had agreed to serve as an observer in the process, which in practical terms meant that both sides would be negotiating with the knowledge that the outcome mattered to humans, which was itself a significant stabilizing factor. Ruth walked out of the room and down the corridor toward the operations room. I walked beside her. "They will negotiate," she said. "Yes, I are not," she said, "a bad people. They are a young civilization that expanded into a situation they did not fully understand. That is recoverable." She paused. "If they handle the next period well, they could become a genuinely useful member of the conclave in 20 years. "You are already planning 20 years ahead," I said. "Always," she said without any particular emphasis, as if this were simply how one moved through the galaxy. I stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at me. "I told Viral," I said, "that humans are kind, that the warmth is real, that it is the same capacity as everything else, just expressed differently." "Yes," she said. I said. "The meeting we just had was that, the same thing, expressed in that direction." She looked at me for a moment. Her expression was, as always, calm, but there was something behind it. Something that was not quite a smile but was in the same family. We try, she said, when the situation allows it. She looked down the corridor. The Thessian medical ships reached the outpost personnel this morning. Everyone who was injured is expected to recover. She walked away. I stood in the corridor for a moment, and I thought about everything that had happened in the past 3 days. And I thought about Viral's question, about whether it was lonely, knowing what I knew, being what I was, standing at the intersection of all that history and all that capacity, in a station orbiting a neutral star in a galaxy that mostly watched from a careful distance. And I thought, honestly, that the loneliness was there sometimes. It was real, but it was not the whole of it. I thought about Ruth Aldridge walking calmly into a room full of people who had made a serious mistake and offering them a clear way forward. Because that was what the situation needed, and she was capable of providing it. I thought about Helen Bryce on a maintenance communication channel in the dark, 300 people and no way out, saying simply, "We know this station better than they do. That is our advantage. We are going to use it completely." I thought about 2 people in a corridor who had made the hardest calculation, and made it without hesitating, for the sake of 298 people they had committed to. I thought about Viral, who had asked a question in a briefing room 3 days ago because he genuinely wanted to understand the answer, and who had listened all the way through, and who had arrived, on his own, at a truth that most species in this building had never tried to articulate. The warmth is real. The other thing is also real. They are the same thing. I went to find him. I wanted to tell him about the meeting. I wanted to tell him that the Thessian delegation's injured personnel were going to be all right. I wanted to sit across from him with a cup of something warm and be a person having a conversation with another person, which was the oldest and most ordinary thing in the galaxy, and also, in its way, the most important. He was in the small lounge off the east corridor, sitting by the window, looking at the stars. He heard me come in. He turned around. "The Gareth?" he asked. "Negotiating," I said. "Starting tomorrow morning. Ruth thinks they can reach a settlement within a week if they stay honest." He nodded slowly. Something in his expression settled. "And the personnel at the outposts?" "Medical ships arrived this morning," I said. "Everyone is expected to recover." He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he looked calmer than he had in 3 days. I poured 2 cups of something from the machine in the corner and brought one to him, and sat down in the chair across from his. Outside the window, the stars were where they had always been. Steady and scattered and countless, each one a sun, each possibly circled by a world where someone was afraid of something tonight. That had always been true. It would probably always be true. But between the stars, right now, a small fleet of human medical ships was crossing the dark as fast as they could. And in a conference room in the center of this station, paperwork was being prepared for a negotiation that might, if it went well, turn a potential conflict into a functional relationship between peoples who had started the week as strangers. These things were also true. Both of them at once, the fear and the response to fear, the harm and the effort toward repair, existing simultaneously in the same galaxy, the same station, the same night. Viral wrapped both of his hands around his cup and looked at me across the small table. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me the truth." "Thank you," I said, "for asking for it." We sat there for a while. 2 people from 2 different species, in a station orbiting a quiet star, drinking something warm in the dark, while the galaxy turned around us at the pace it had always turned, indifferent and vast and full of everything that mattered. Outside, somewhere far away, a Keth officer's warning was either reaching the Gareth High Command or it was not. That was someone else's concern now. Here in this room, everything that needed to happen was already happening. That was enough.